of HASID webinar series. HASID stands for Hybrid Human Artificial Collective Intelligence in Open-Ended Domains. It's a Horizon Europe project, and we are in the final year of the project, which started in September 2022. Before I go on to the speakers, I would like to share some engagement rules. So we have 2 talks today. Each talk will be followed by a Q&A session. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and please upvote the relevant ones so that it's easier for us to pick them up. You will be muted and your videos are off since we are recording the webinars, this webinar. So do let us know if you want to speak. We can unmute you. So first, we have Professor Jason Lowe from the UK Met Office talking about scaling the delivery of climate services. He's a principal fellow and head of climate services for the government at the Met Office and chair in interdisciplinary climate research at the Priestley Center, University of Leeds. With over 20 years of experience, Jason has contributed to scientific publications on climate mitigation and adaptation. He leads the UKCP project, which developed innovative climate scenarios for the UK, which has been extensively used in the recent UK climate change risk assessment and the 3rd National Adaptation Programme. Internationally, Jason has contributed to all 3 working groups in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and various UN climate reports, advising governments and stakeholders on climate variability and change. Recently, he has focused on providing climate change information to the finance sector, including through the Climate Financial Risk Forum. Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Neha. I'm going to try and share my screen using PowerPoint Live. I should say, like most of the UK at the moment, I seem to be suffering from hay fever. So hopefully my voice will last. I will be taking quite a number of sips of water, though, to help me through this. So when the slides appear, could you confirm you can see them, please, Neha?
I can see them, Jason. Thanks.
Excellent. So I want to start actually by setting the context for climate services. I suspect of the people in the audience, some of you will have heard the term climate services. Some of you won't have heard it, but will extrapolate from the words climate and services. And some of you will be thinking, what on earth is this? I know what climate science is, but I don't know what services are. We will come up with a formal definition, and we'll also come up with a simpler working definition as we go through the talk. But first, I like to show a variant of this slide in many of the talks I give. I think it really sets the context of where we are in terms of the changing climate. On the left-hand side, this set of curves, it shows the global average near-surface temperature change over time, and it's anomalized relative to pre-industrial times. And there are several lines. These are each from a different climate center around the world. The lines largely agree with each other, and that's reassuring. It gives us extra confidence in what we're seeing in terms of the change in temperature over time. And you can see the upward movement, climate change, as we progress through the 20th and into the 21st century. You can also see that the change isn't a smooth one. There are lots of wiggles. And we know this because the temperature varies from hour to hour, day to day, month to month, year to year. So what we need to conceptualize is the idea of natural variability on top of the trend. You can also see at the end of this curve, 2024, this was the warmest year in the record. For the first time, we had a single year exceeding 1.5 degrees C. If we take a longer term view, so we think of what does that mean for the average climate temperature, which is the temperature that usually features in climate negotiations, then we're roughly at around 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels. On the right-hand side, I wanted to illustrate the fact that, of course, nobody experiences the global average, annual average temperature. What they experience is the local weather now and going into the future. And if we look around the globe, including at the UK, then we have seen measurable changes in a whole range of climate extremes. So, for instance, we have seen increases in the fraction of rainfall that falls in the most intense precipitation events. Many occasions that leads to flooding. We've also seen temperature records broken around the world. I'm showing an illustration here of the fairly recent hot event in the US and Canada. We also see droughts. Now, with droughts, the natural variability is so large that it's only over part of the globe that we're seeing the climate signal emerge from that background variability. We're also seeing other variables change that can have an impact, and I'm illustrating with the bottom right the increase in sea level. And the rate of sea level increase as a global average at the moment is in excess of 4 millimeters per year, and that represents a very significant acceleration over recent decades. Also, when we think of the context, it's not only the amount of change that we need to consider, it's the fact that the rate of climate change is increasing in many variables. And as an example, I picked a stat here from a colleague at the Met Office who has been looking at the chance of exceeding 40 degrees C in the UK. And they note that this has increased significantly by a factor of 4 over the last 30 years or so. So the climate is changing. We can measure that. We can see a human fingerprint in it. When we look to the future, we don't know what the emissions of greenhouse gases will be at the moment. And so we run a series of alternative projections, alternative futures. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing more than 1,000 different views of how the emissions of greenhouse gases might change into the future. Now, each of these is internally consistent and is considered plausible within the framework of integrated assessment models. And they differ because of assumptions around technology, policy, population growth, trade, and even personal preferences. And I've color coded in green those that give more than a 50% chance of being below 1.5 degrees of warming at the end of the century. And you can see they show very rapid reductions in the near term in the greenhouse gas emissions. And many of them also show the need for net negative or artificial additional greenhouse gas removals. On the right-hand side, I'm showing the global mean temperature response. And those 3 stars are really quite important. So the blue one is if you take all of the announcements for net zero, many that are not connected with policy, and add them together, it puts us in that range of being a little under 2 degrees, but even then not quite reaching 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. If we take the yellow case, this is where you get to if you add up the current policies. So that's saying we're not on course for 1.5 degrees at present, but there are technically feasible pathways still available that could just about keep us under 1.5, and more pathways if we want to be under 1.5 at the end of the century. There are also pathways that represent a backtrack on current policy. That's shown by the red star. This is important to consider for risk assessment. So this is a view of the climate context. If we think of adaptation, then in the science, we're seeing this move from, on the left, risk assessment, and I'm showing some reports, for instance, the UK climate change risk assessment. This is a plot from the 3rd edition of that. We're currently preparing the 4th. But there are other national research assessment frameworks, and increasingly individual organisations are carrying out their own risk assessment for climate physical risks. Some of those driven by TCFD and other reporting frameworks. On the right-hand side, I wanted to illustrate a view that comes from the Committee on Climate Change, who monitors progress in both mitigation and adaptation for the UK, and highlights that at the moment adaptation and reporting the risk are lagging and responding to the risk are lagging behind climate change. So while there is some progress, it's not keeping up with the pace of climate change. So this is where climate services come in. Climate services are one of the tools that will help us mitigate and adapt, and they bridge the gap between climate science and the needs of users. This is formal definition from another EU project, Climate Europe, really trying to explain what a climate service is. So the provision of climate information to assist decision making, so it has a particular purpose, must respond to user needs, must be scientifically credible, and that's both the information and the expertise that's providing it, and it requires the appropriate engagement between users and providers. A simpler definition might be simply to say it's the process of making climate science information both useful and usable. We could also add used to that list. So now we know what a climate service is. Let's see some examples. And I picked examples from my Met Office collection. However, many of these do also involve partnership activities, and partnerships really are vital, I think, in many cases for delivering climate services because they cut across so many different disciplines. And I've split the list here into two. So along the top, these are more data-driven or data-focused climate services. And along the bottom, these are more engagement-driven or engagement-focused services. So if we just perhaps go into a couple of these, the top left, the provision of observational data. There are many users want gridded information on what we've seen in terms of UK weather and climate over recent years, but also extending into the distant past. Many also want aggregated summaries. And so we have a service through the National Climate Information Centre that provides that. We also provide initialized seasonal forecasts. So these are looking typically 3 months ahead. And while they don't give you a detailed view of the weather on a particular day, they can give an indication of whether we're heading towards a wetter than average period, or drier than average, or hotter or colder or windier, or stiller than average. And they're increasingly being used in decision making. One way we distribute the data from these is through the Copernicus Climate Service, C3S. I'll pick the one on the right as well. This is actually a service that builds on climate projections with work from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And what UKCH did was construct a new set of data products that focus on river flows. And in particular, there has been interest in this data set for low flows. And that's been used, for instance, to ask questions, will there be enough water for energy generation as we move into the future? Or if we were to pursue a hydrogen economy, is there enough water that would be available for the various processes of extracting hydrogen? On the engagement-led services, we produce a lot of tailored briefings to government. These are based increasingly around a co-development process, and over time we have realized the closer you can get to the policy question, often the better they land. But we also produce briefings for other organizations like local authorities. Additionally, less of a briefing activity, but very much involving an engagement and an expert-led contribution, is the idea of consultancy type services. And on the right-hand side, we also produce a range of capacity building services into the international development space. So these are some of the services that we're able to deliver. We also take part in a range of research projects around delivering services that enable us to really understand the process of doing this. And one such project was the Strategic Priorities Fund UK Climate Resilience Programme that ended a year or so ago. This helped us recognise something that seems to be widely accepted, and it comes with a particular quotation that you'll see in many places in the literature, that a lot of projects produce pilot climate services as one-offs or demonstrations. But these pilots, well, pilots never fail, but also there's an issue here that pilots never scale. And if we want to move towards a well-adapted, low-carbon UK, I would argue that we need to get better at the idea of scaling climate services. And the fact that climate services are not being taken up on a large scale represents, in my view, a series of market failures. And we will only address this if we take account of the complex environment of government, both nationally and locally, private sector and academia working together. So what can we do about scaling? If we want to have more impact from the climate services, we need to understand what are the characteristics of scaling that work. And one of the contributing pieces of work that's really moved on my thinking here, it started with a review of the literature around scaling. That's for both climate services, but also for other types of services. And we recognized in this literature review, firstly, there are different types of scaling. So horizontal scaling is what most people think of, and that's simply trying to reach more people. But there are other types of scaling as well. So reaching the same users, but with more capability. So that's functional scaling. There's also vertical scaling, which is about changing the enabling factors within an organization or even a sector. Now, within the paper, we were able to draw out some of the characteristics that enable successful scaling. And I won't just read all of the items off the infographic, but some of the things that do stand out are that planning and scaling from the beginning tends to be more effective. Making sure there's a clear view as to how you will fund the climate service to stop it failing in the longer term. And that idea of having a sustainable view to funding is a really strong consideration for sustainable services. There's also a need to think about the environment that you deliver into, and also how you go about monitoring the uptake and the progress within the service. Life cycling increasingly is something that I think we're also recognizing in that services do age and need updating. So we have a theoretical understanding based on the literature. What we've been doing at the Met Office, and I want to share and get your views on, is how we've then taken that forward in a practical sense. This represents very much work that is ongoing. So I'm not going to reach a conclusion in this. I'm going to give you our initial thoughts. And so if we start with a diagram like this, on the left-hand side, we've got our climate data and our climate science. We've got bridging science that takes the underpinning climate science closer to when it's ready to be used in services. And we've also got data science. On the right-hand side, we've got end users and beneficiaries. And this is important because we recognize that sometimes the beneficiaries are not the users themselves. And I'm taking the view of how do we produce this idea of a low carbon, more resilient UK at scale. So climate services fit in this space, but how do we do it at scale? Well, one way of doing that is using tailored data feeds, and recognizing that sometimes the end users are able to use those data feeds directly. But also, if we encourage other people, other climate service providers, to build services on the top of our data, then we'll reach many more end users. And increasingly, we're taking this view that, we want other climate service providers to be around and providing services that use the climate data that we've produced in a whole range of research projects, and in many cases is funded by UK government. An example of this is in the relationship we formed with Esri, and this led to the development of a climate data portal. I'd like to go into that in a little bit more detail, because here there was really a story to tell that began with a research project in the UK Climate Resilience Programme, where we wanted to work with a small number of cities to improve their the tools they had to raise awareness amongst their own stakeholders on the potential impacts of climate change. And on the left-hand side, we developed this idea of city packs to use for this communication purposes. Once we started to take those out so other cities saw them, the demand increased. I think we got to low 20s in terms of the number of cities, but we were struggling to produce these manually. We also wanted to go beyond the awareness raising stage and provide a means that was more suitable for the types of approaches to handling data that spatial planners in cities were using. So previously, we as a climate community had provided data, but not in a GIS format that was more suitable for the approaches that are used within the cities and where they have their skill sets. And so what we've been doing in terms of scaling is to produce something with funding from DEFRA, that is a local authority climate service that does enable one to click through to the data in a GIS format, but it also means all councils over the UK are able to go in, and because we've automated the process, they can produce tailored information products on the climate change in their location. There's also a community site with information on adaptation that is included. And we've provided some training to civil contingency advisors so that they can also feed into this process around the local authorities. So this is an example where we've started with a research project. We've recognized a benefit of scaling, and then we've applied the principles to produce an appropriate tailored data feed with adequate guidance to support it. Another way is to recognize that delivering consultancy-based services is actually quite difficult to scale. You can never have enough consultants to do this for the scale of the problem in the UK or globally. So here, although any particular consultancy like that at the Met Office will tend to specialize in particular areas and also use that experience to learn about the users, we need to get better again at enabling other climate service providers. And one way of doing that we're focusing on is through training and guidance. And the team at the Met Office has been working on trying to provide some good practice training approaches, which we're then going to apply in to priority sectors. And what we really hope is this enables other providers to use more of our data in their consultancy work, and also build on the scientific findings we have. So it becomes another way of pulling the information across to user benefit. we carry on going down this view. Another way of amplifying the reach and value of the science is through translation to policy and regulation. And I gave a couple of examples previously around translation to policy. Interestingly, there's less of that taken place for regulators. So we think there are some particular wins around supporting regulators to include climate, both variability and change in their regulation, and also in national and international standards, for instance, from ISO and BSI. In terms of recent progress, so on the left-hand side, I had the pleasure of taking part in a process over the last year or so with the finance sector. So the Climate Financial Risk Forum has produced a set of guidance on good practice risk assessment for the sector. We were able to feed into that, and we're currently working with that group to produce a set of case studies and a how-to guide. We're also engaging directly with a number of regulators thinking about stress testing and supporting them with both data and expert advice. And we're looking about how we can feed in more directly into updates of BSI and ISO standards, because many of these do refer to weather, but sometimes the information is outdated. And then the final channel I wanted to highlight is that we see benefit from engagement directly with the public. And this is both awareness raising, but also behavioural change that we see happening. And this is often an indirect route, but we need to recognise that those people who do take part more directly in adaptation and mitigation decision making are members of the public too. And so this idea of having a more climate literate public in which to deliver climate services either into or through is actually a really useful step. And something we've been doing here is a rapid attribution climate service that helps people understand how changes, for instance, in extreme events have been influenced by large-scale climate change. And this also links very much to working closely with, for instance, the media. So these are the approaches to amplification that we've been trying. We can put them together in a summary slide here. And we're now operating a project within the Met Office to put this into practice. And what we will do over the coming couple of years is develop and deliver new climate services at scale. And we're doing that into the infrastructure area, where we have a mandate from the last National Infrastructure Assessment, and also into the finance sector using the mandate from the CFRF. We'll also be looking about how we better scale existing climate services, because I think there are lots of opportunity from the pilots and demonstrators that have been produced. Part of what we do needs to think about this idea of sustainable funding for climate services, and also the processes we have within our organisation. Other organisations also wanting to scale climate services almost certainly would need to go through this as well. So we're going to record and publish those lessons. And we're also working with the external community to see what type of support might be needed for the climate service sector in the UK, and to contribute to the idea of a national framework on climate services. We're actively discussing this with external players at the moment. So that's where we've got to. I'm going to stop at that point. Hopefully it gives you a flavour of our climate service work and why we are trying to focus on scaling.
Thank you so much, Jason. I think that was really interesting. While we wait for people to include their questions in Q&A, I would really like to ask this one question to you, probably two. One is, have you envisaged any barriers in this work or challenges, particularly the project that has been just initiated at the Met Office? And what are your thoughts on overcoming those barriers, or do you think that it will come across during the course of the project?
Yeah, there are lots of barriers to delivering at scale. Some of those are technical barriers. You can look in many organizations, you'll feel that maybe they are developing too many one-off solutions. We certainly do that at the Met Office. So we need to get better when it comes to reusing and applying existing approaches and really having that corporate memory around climate services. I think there's a barrier around how we move from the pilots into the scalable service. And that's also reflected in the need to actually invest. So there are funding barriers in pilots if you want to make them into a scalable service. There's probably not enough thinking when people do produce pilots or demonstrators of how they might go about moving this into something that generates more benefit. There are also issues around how we go about monitoring the benefit. And then the last one, I think we need probably to improve the types of discovery process that assess, well, how big is the need, what is the need, and that understands the full chain that you have to apply if you want to get the benefit, i.e. that well adapted, low carbon, resilient community business at the end of it, because often there's a weak link in that chain, and one weak link, and that process will fail.
Thanks, Jason. How do you want to come in?
Yeah, if there's time, like I think one thing that stood out to me is your beautiful diagram of science on the left and users on the right, and all of the arrows were flowing from left to right. Now, I wonder if you could say anything about how the user needs might change the science, right? Because science doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's always a choice of what science we do. So what about that feedback loop?
Yeah, no, that's tremendously important. And I do have a version of that diagram that has a series of other loops going back in the other direction. So I mean, let's think about what that feedback flows between first. So there needs to be feedback between the users and the climate service providers, between the climate service providers and the climate science providers, between the users, the end users, and the climate science providers. So we're trying to put all of those in place. So when we design, for instance, our Met Office Hadley Centre climate programme, we spend a lot of time with government departments, DESNES, DEFRA, FCDO, understanding what their end requirements are and using that to adjust the type of science we produce. Increasingly, we're also recognizing that there's more information from, for instance, the climate consultants and that community that we can pull directly into our design of underpinning climate science. And an example of where we're really using the feedback is many people will have heard of UKCP18, a set of climate projections. We're thinking about, is there a need to update that? And we've been through a process of which Neha has done some tremendous work in terms of surveying quite large groups over what their current needs are, but also the enablers and barriers and what type of problem they might have in the future. And we've combined that with focus groups and also the opportunistic cases of simply working really closely with groups where we can go a little bit deeper. So absolutely we need it. We do it to some extent. We don't do it perfectly. It would be good if people have got advice on how we could improve that, because we're game to do that.
Thanks, Jason. I don't see any other questions, but please feel free to, Paul, do you want to very quickly come in? Can we unmute Paul Citrali?
Yes, let me do. Please try to mute yourself on camera if you want.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Citrali.
Sally. So I've done that. Yes. So, thank you, Jason. Yeah, fascinating talk. And the point that struck me was obviously pilots don't scale. And I'm working for an organisation. I work for the Bannerbachaina National Park Authority. And the kind of information we rely on is still kind of quite coarse in that it doesn't enable us to make kind of locally relevant decisions. I'm still kind of sort of harking back to the a lot of the analysis that the UK SIP was doing back in the early and mid noughties, which was really useful at the time, and that's kind of generated the momentum. And you're quite right, pilots don't scale. Pilots are fit for the circumstances in which they're developed, and they very rarely translate into other areas, not even in the area that you've built them for. So I was just wondering whether the Met Office has considered doing something like embedding officers and researchers within organizations at the front line, trying to make use of this information. So to refer back to Howell's point, that flow of science from one side to the other, the Met Office would see exactly how that is or isn't working if you had people embedded with organizations trying to grapple with the challenges. Thank you.
Yeah, Paul, I think that's a very good point. The answer is yes to some extent, but no, not enough. So this idea of really embedding yourself into a particular application, understanding what the need is, understanding what's just not working, understanding how the decision is made. We're able to do that in some contexts, in some sectors with some users. So, for instance, there's some very good embedding going on into the power supply sector at the moment. We've got some good embedding with the finance sector at the moment, and that works both ways. We've also managed to get somebody coming across from the finance sector as a secondee into the Met Office, and that's really helping with the fact that in some cases there's even a language and jargon barrier over this. So we're starting to do it. I think we do recognise it. We don't do enough of it.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Jason. Thanks again for excellent talk and for taking some of the questions. We'll go to the second talk.
So,
I'll just quickly introduce you. We have Professor Howell Williams from the University of Exeter who will discuss smart agents and introduce the UKCP chatbot. Professor Williams, an expert in sustainability and environmental change, is a professor in environmental data science at the University of Exeter. He's affiliated with the Institute of Data Science and Artificial Intelligence and the Global Systems Institute, and is a visiting fellow at Plymouth Marine Laboratory. After earning his PhD in complex systems from the University of Leeds in 2006, he worked at the University of East Anglia before joining the University of Exeter in 2011. He was promoted to associate professor in data science in 2019 and to professor in environmental data science in 2022. He applies complex systems thinking and computational methods to various fields, including social sciences, environmental sciences, evolutionary ecology, and artificial intelligence. Over to you, Howell.
Thanks, Naya. So I'm going to try and share my screen, and I have prepared possibly a little bit too much material. but let's see how we go. I was aiming for 25 minutes. I'll try and do it in 15. So can you see my screen? Can you see my screen now?
I can see your screen. Thanks.
Okay, so I can't see you anymore. So do shout if you need to. So I'll jump straight in. So I'm going to talk today about smart agents for complex environmental data, and it fits very neatly in with what Jason was saying about the need to scale up climate services. What I'll talk about today is one way in which you could consider doing that. So firstly, the people who do the actual work, the team, here they are. I won't go through them individually, but you know, obviously I'm a being of pure administration and meetings these days, but these are the guys who actually do the work. Also, this project that I'll speak about has been a collaborative effort with the Met Office, in particular, Fai Feng, Hatim Chahut, Tristan Plyground, Rachel McInnes, and Jason Lowe. So I'm pleased to talk about it today. So what do I mean by smart agents for complex environmental data? Well, if you look at the bottom row there's lots of different types of environmental data. And it is fair to say that the days when data was rare and expensive and you had to put a lot of effort into collecting it, those days are gone. We are drowning in data from all sorts of different sources. So it could be Earth observation or automatic monitoring of ecosystems. It is satellites and drones. It is autonomous monitoring systems. Also, the models that we use are producing data themselves, whereas we have the entirety of the World Wide Web storing most of human knowledge and geospatial systems. It goes on and on and on. And at the top row there, we've got a lot of people who would like to use this information, this data, to make better decisions about climate and environment. And there simply aren't enough human beings in between to satisfy that need. So with the recent advances in AI, so you would all have seen things like ChatGPT and large language models. These technologies are a bit of a game changer in how we can access information, how we can synthesize information and make it useful to people. So when I talk about smart agents for complex environmental data, it's the idea that we can use generative AI as this sort of glue between the huge volume of data on one side and the people who need the information on the other side to try and democratize access and open that up. So yeah, here it is again, basically many more people needing to make decisions than there are climate scientists. And if we can use the AI correctly and in a robust and rigorous way, then we can democratize access to science and it can be widely shared. So I'll talk about this UKCP18 chatbot. We've been working on this for about 18 months now. And the question is really very simple. It's how do we make climate information more accessible with large language models? That was where we started. And we have been teaching ourselves as we go. This was a thing that was just an idea 2 years ago. We got going and now there are quite a few projects in this area. It's a very rapidly evolving area, as you can imagine. So the UKCP climate projections, there's lots of different types of data there. There's data sets, there's numbers, there's tables, there's maps and images. There's a lot of PDFs and text documents, and we wanted to make all of that available. So Arjun, I think, is on the call. He's done a lot of the work on this project, along with the collaborators I mentioned. And the target functionality we're going for is a chatbot, because that's a simple interface, very familiar, where you can ask a natural language question and get a sensible, scientifically justified answer back about anything that is in the UKCP archive. So that's question answering, providing text and images, but you also want to know where the source of the information was so that we can trace back to the original document that provided that information. We want people to be able to access data files and download information that they might want to use in their own analysis. Jason talked about the Esri data portal, this idea of getting data into the hands of third parties who can do sort of additional analysis and link it to other data. And recently we've been experimenting with interactive data visualization, and I'll show you a bit of that in a moment. So to make the information easily available, we need to be really sure that we're not hallucinating. So if you haven't heard of hallucinations with language models, it's this idea that they can make things up, right? So they are just a statistical process. They don't actually know anything about the world. All they do is read text and make a probabilistic assumption about what the answer should be. I won't go into how that happens because that's another lecture, but what we want to do is stop that, because we don't want people making things up about UKCP, and wrong information is worse than no information. So we've put a lot of effort into a retrieval augmented generation scheme. This is the idea that you limit the language model to a particular corpus, a set of documents. That's the allowed universe of knowledge. And you say, answer these questions only using that knowledge. And there's a whole set of steps that go into this. So you have to break up your corpus into chunks. We call them chunks. That's a basically small part of a document, like a paragraph or a section. You need to extract all the images and make appropriate metadata to describe those images. And you can use the language models for that process as well. You need to take a user question and put it into some vectorized form where the question can be compared to the knowledge that's available. And then you need to take the question and the most likely chunks to answer that question and feed them back to the language model for it to generate an answer. So I can go into more detail, but I won't now because time is short. So what does a prompt look like? You may have heard of a prompt. If you've talked to ChatGPT, then you've written a prompt. So there are two types of prompt. One is a user prompt. That's when you ask a question. But behind the scenes, there's a thing called a system prompt. And this is where you coach the language model in how to behave. And it is just like talking to an actor or a stubborn child or something like that. You give them very detailed instructions about what they can and can't do, in English. So here's the prompt that we used for the UKCP bot, or well, part of it anyway. It's much longer. And this was arrived at largely by trial and error. But it starts off by telling the model, you are an expert on the UKCP. It's a set of tools and data. Answer the question that you are asked. You must read all of the information. You provide an expert level response. Under no circumstances should you use information from other sources, etc., etc., etc. So you coach the model on how to behave. And then when the user asks a question, it reads the system prompt first to know how to behave and then tries to answer the question. So building the pipeline, this was a long process, really. We tried lots of different versions, or I say we, I mean Arjun, he tried a lot of different iterations. How do you do these things? There are many choices, design choices. It's not obvious what the best method. This is all new. Nobody has written textbooks about this. We're making it up as we go along scientifically. So there's a lot of experimentation and a lot of metrics were derived to try and test the answers and make sure we were doing it in the best possible way. You can see the pipeline down below, lots of blobs and arrows and data flows. And essentially you end up with, well, we tested 14 different pipelines on synthetic questions and answers that were generated from the data. And you get a load of scores, and I won't go into what they all mean, but they're essentially coming down to testing the quality of the answer that was produced. So is it faithful to the underlying data? Is it relevant to the question? Does it cover the detail? Does it give you facts and figures and names and places rather than just generalities? And when you do all of that, you end up with a best model. And we showed the best model to some human users from the Met Office. We had 10 people who played around with the chatbot and asked some questions and got some answers, and then did a survey to test what they thought of it. So on the left, we're looking at answer quality, and we found that, the two blue lines there are two different models that were scored well on automated testing. And we found good answers for relevance, understandability, specificity, comprehensiveness, and authority in the answer that was given. So we feel good about that. And if you look on the right-hand side, you've got interaction quality. This was how it felt to use the chatbot. Was it usable and easy to understand what was going on? So most people felt that the best model was pretty simple to use. It felt quite natural, somewhat authoritative, comprehensive, specific, and understandable. And essentially, this is like our beginning of trying to make these things good for humans to use, right? We don't want to create some tool that is only good in principle. We want it to work in practice. So I'm going to try and show you a demo. Here's a screenshot of the bot as it currently exists. And if I get this right, now, let's see, where is it? Here. So I'm going to play a short video and talk over it. Can you still hear me? I can't see you, so I'm assuming that that's right.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
So here we are. Right, this is what happens. You open up the chatbot. It looks like a chatbot. You're in a browser window, and it says, "Hi there, I'm the chatbot." You ask a question. So tell me about UKCP, and it pops up with an answer. This is a description of what the UKCP is on the right. Here are some images that summarize the information in the archive. And now we're testing out the data functionality. This is all very, very fast because I'm trying to show it quickly. You can say, I want temperature data in Liverpool. It asks you some questions about exactly what do you mean? Do you want, it gives you some defaults and then says, well, do you want air temperature, minimum, maximum, mean? So we say, we'll have the mean. When do you want it? The time slice. You enter some more information. And then it's generated a data file on the fly. And you say, now let's go into data analysis mode and plot the monthly mean temperature of the year 2010, months on the x-axis, temperature on the y-axis. It remembers that we're talking about Liverpool. It knows which data file it's generated, and this is the answer, right? So and this idea is that it's a one-stop shop. You can ask questions about the archive, about the science that's contained in the reports. You can trace the sources of those answers. You can extract data. You can analyze data inside the chatbot. So if you want a simple question to be answered that hasn't been written about in one of the reports, you're generating your own analysis on the fly. Behind the scenes, it's writing Python code to interrogate that data file that it's created for you. And you can go back and say, well, please, can you add an error bar? Or can you compare 2 years together? Or can you show me Liverpool against Manchester to see if there's a difference? And you can imagine your own analysis you might want to do with that. So back to my slides. So the next steps for this project, well, we need to do a bit more testing. We're launching now a user-centered design study. I'll tell you about that on the next slide. We're going to do some beta testing. We're hoping to launch this internally at Met Office at the end of the summer so that people can play around. And what we're going to do when we launch it is track all of the interactions. So we're logging all of the information, how long people spend on it, what questions they answer, what questions they ask and how the answers look, and really try and get a handle on where the need is and how it works for people. And interestingly, for HACCID, we're now embarking on an expansion to climate services. So HACCID project, for those of you who know it, it's a human augmented intelligence project. They've created a thing called a knowledge graph, which is a representation of essentially climate science for climate services. Lots of interactions there. It's a sort of summary of many people's expert knowledge. And we're going to try and plug that into the chatbot so that it can ask questions about adaptation. So, more complex questions than just describe the data, describe the trend. Things like, where should we build a new power station? What is the likely risk to a primary school in Norfolk in 2050? Those sorts of more complex questions. If we can back the chatbot up with the knowledge graph, we think we can get some way towards those sorts of things. I don't think we're going to create, a climate consultant any day soon, but I think that the attempt will be informative and we'll learn a lot as we go along. And who knows where we can get to. All right, if you want to join our study and have a go at it, please do use this. I'll leave this on screen for a second. That's the QR code. We'll also circulate an invite through various mailing lists. We need a lot of people, really as many as we can get. So if you're interested in whether the tool is well designed or trustworthy, if you can imagine using it in your daily work or not, and you have a reason for that, we want to hear from you. So we're interested in negatives as well as positives. And there's a big question: should the Met Office be doing this? Right? This is a collaborative project with the Met Office. We want to know, if Met Office is to develop this kind of tool, what should it look like? What should the constraints be? Are there things it should never do, or things that it should be doing? What's the opportunity? What's the risk? So please do come along and help us answer these questions so that we can get it right. Okay, I will go in 1 minute through 3 more case studies. So we're working with other people. So with Ordnance Survey, we're looking at geospatial data. They have lots of maps. Can you ask natural language questions and get answers about geospatial information? The answer is yes, but it's hard. So we have a chatbot that does that, a paper in preparation. I won't go into the detail, but it does work, right? You can ask it to find bridges in Southampton or pubs in the Lake District, and it will do it. And we're working with them to expand that methodology. And you can see the applications here for climate in getting that geospatial component right. With Natural Resources Wales, we're looking at how we can use this sort of tool to automate access to their archives. They have decades worth of ecological reports which are mouldering in a library, and they want to make it more accessible and sustain the access to that information. So we're creating a natural language interface for that data. And with Plymouth Marine Lab and Living Wales, we're doing a project with Earth observation data. The example on the right shows it really. The user says, provide land cover statistics for Swansea in 2018. It goes off, interrogates a thing called a data cube, lots of Earth observation information, comes back, it's generated a table of land use statistics and a map of how the land cover looks in that area, centered on Swansea. And this is a really nice interface for people who are not experts in Earth observation, but might want to use that information. So lots of things going on. And before I shut up, I'm just going to pick on one discussion point. So clearly, the key thing in any of this type of work is trust. And to generate trust, we think that things that are important are explainability. So the bot must always be able to say why it generated a particular answer, and also keeping humans involved. So we can use conversationality, interactions back and forth to make sure we're doing the right thing, that the chatbot's answering the right question. It can ask you if it doesn't know what you want. And we're working on that kind of feedback loop, that conversation, as a way of making sure that it's solving the problem that you really need it to. And I think there are other things to say, but I'll stop there and allow a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Howard, for there was very limited time for you. I apologize, but you have done a fantastic job, and especially showing us the chatbot demo as well. That was excellent. Just one request: can you pop in the link for people to participate in chatbot testing if they would like to, if they haven't got a chance to scan the QR code, maybe they can use the link. So if you can put the link in the chat, that would be great.
In the chat just now, yeah.
And just maybe time for one question. Paul says that what's the comparison between AI answer or interaction quality and human-generated answer? So I think it goes back to the last slide that you just showed, the trust and explainability. So can you please?
Yeah, I can say something about that. So maybe, I think Sashini might be on the call. Maybe Sashini, can you put the link to the sign up for the testing in the chat, and then I can answer the question. Thank you. So the way we did the validation and testing of the chatbot was to generate human answers to the questions and then compare the machine answer and try to score them qualitatively. It's hard to do that quantitatively. And it's interesting. If you get a human to read both answers, sometimes they prefer the machine, sometimes they prefer the human. I think humans are better at getting to the sense of a question, but the machines, because they answer in a more formulaic way, they can be more complete sometimes. And sometimes a human answer will go off on a tangent that the answerer likes rather than where the evidence is. So I think there are strengths and weaknesses. But I think a better question is actually, do you make better decisions with this tool or without it? So the experiment that we're going to run, well, we're doing our testing experiment, as mentioned. The one I want to do next is actually doing experimental studies of, if you give a set of humans, reasonably sensible, intelligent humans with some knowledge of climate, if you give them access to a chatbot that can do this stuff that I showed, or to the UKCP website, or to Google, and then ask them to, I don't know, pick a location for a new nuclear power station, and you give them an hour to do it, which team wins? And essentially, these tools have no value if they don't help people get better decisions. So I think we've got to focus on that output rather than just making things that are shiny or pretty or, accuracy is like a foundation, reliability, but beyond that, are they helpful? And I think that's the real test.
Thanks, Al.
Sashini's put the link in the chat there. So please do sign up. It would be great if we just need as many people as possible to come and pull it apart and really help us to make it better and make it robust.
Right. We're just 1 minute past one. Thank you so much, both. I think I really enjoyed the presentations. I hope everyone did as well. And we'll probably stop here. And if you have any questions, would it be all right if they get in touch with you directly, Jason? How?
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's one on uncertainty in the chat that probably is a longer answer. So if you want to send that on to me, I can answer that one.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And I think we're both easy to find, so drop us a line. Yeah.
Thank you both, and thanks everyone for joining us today for the webinar.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for
Bye-bye.
the opportunity. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.